it comes to colour grading, the first thing that we need to worry about is our contrast. It's step one in any colour grade. But what is contrast? Well, contrast is the spread of tonality across your image. So in other words, it's the spread from black to white across your image. Where do those values fall? There's another term that we use an awful lot, which is dynamic range. And the dynamic range of your image is the difference between the darkest part and the lightest part. If they're close together, it's low dynamic range. If they're far apart, it's high dynamic range. So for example, the scene that we have here, we've got deep shadow in the sort of lower parts of the bushes behind me, and then we've got reflective leaves. There's a whole spread of dynamic range across this image. If it was low dynamic range, it would be grey, it would be compressed in terms of the difference between the brightest parts and the darkest parts. Contrast is a really crucial way that we communicate clarity to the viewer. In a commercial, contrast can be used to really add depth and allow subjects and products to pop out of the screen. Well, a friend of mine, Brett Danton, kindly said that we could use his commercial for Nick Scali sofas in Australia, which he was the director on, to illustrate how we can work with contrast, how we can read scopes to tell us about the contrast in our image, and then how we can push that contrast around and take the opportunity to redistribute this tonal range and to alter the dynamic range if we want to produce an image that really pops and stands out of the screen.
I'm Brett Danton. I'm a cinema photographer director. And I started as a stills photographer, so I did advertising stills for many years, and then sort of did quite a bit of DIP work, and then gradually transitioned across to director. You know, I think you need to personally do time as a DP and learn how to move the camera and tell the story with the camera to move on to directing. So that's what I've tried to achieve, but I still seem to be working at it every single day. As a director, DP, I know what a camera can do and what a camera can't do. That pushes the quality of the imagery, and as a result, the clients I sort of ended up working for, most of them sell their product on their imagery. So, you know, the furniture client I have is purely based on what the images look like. The person's in there, but they're only really in there as a guide to scale and to operate the furniture. So for them, the biggest thing is what the images look like. So that's, you know, that's probably where I get most of my clients from, is, you know, directing, but with the strong image bias.
We're far more sensitive to contrast than we are to colour, and that actually is mimicked by our cameras. So for example, when cameras capture, acquire and then encode video signals, the luma component is always uncompressed. That is always as much information as it can capture. It's only the colour information that's compressed, if it's compressed at all. Even with cameras that are heavily compressing things, there's what's labelled the Y, the luma, is always the channel that comes through essentially as pretty much unscathed, even if quite heavy compression and work is going on with the chroma aspect of the signal. And that's because luminance is just so important, and contrast is luminance. They're one and the same thing. This is one of the reasons why we deal with it first when we're colour grading, because it has just such a major impact on your image, and there's a lot more at stake really in terms of getting contrast right. So how you kind of shift from black to white within your image and how you kind of manipulate that is quite key. And to help people sometimes when you're starting out, and if it's difficult for you to kind of assess the dynamic range of your scene with colour involved, you might find it's helpful to actually get rid of the colour. So it could be that you just desaturate your clip. Maybe you could do that with an adjustment layer in, say, Premiere, or you could do that with a timeline node in Resolve, but you could essentially desaturate everything and save yourself the hassle of thinking about colour. And for some people when they're starting out, it can be a really useful trick for just focusing on the contrast in your image and the spread of tonality within the image. Once you've kind of done that, you can then bring the colour back in and work on that separately. Brightness isn't just an entirely separate issue from colour. It's not like colour itself doesn't have an inherent brightness. And it's quite important to understand that green is brighter than other colours. Green is the colour that our eye has the most sensitivity to. And because of that, more of our cones in our eye are looking and being stimulated by those frequencies, which are kind of around the 5 to 600 nanometer, 550 nanometer kind of area. So our brightness and our perception of brightness is not just coming from rods in our eye, but also from our perception of green. And that is mimicked by cameras. So cameras also extrapolate brightness from a scene from the green channel, and they give that preference to the others. So it was measured how much more perception of brightness in our colour vision green has than red and red does than blue, and that is recreated and mimicked by the way that image signals are processed digitally. And you can actually see this. There's a very well-known graph that we have here. This is known as the luminous efficiency function. It actually shows the combined sensitivity of all the different colours, and you can see a massive spike there towards green. What's interesting though is if you take a simple red, green and blue display, so we've got a test pattern here. If I look at this, it looks to me that they're all roughly the same brightness. It's very difficult to discern if one is brighter than the others, and it's certainly hard to see that one might be potentially much brighter than the others. But that's because of the way that we perceive brightness from various colour channels, and that's also the way that cameras and computer monitors and everything else has been developed to digitally reenact that, if you like. If I actually look at this same test pattern underneath a vector scope, you see that this manifests itself quite clearly. This is the waveform luma for this test pattern in DaVinci Resolve up against a waveform, and you can see 72% brightness, so 72% IRE from the green, 21% from the red, and only 7% from the blue. So that shows you definitively that you can't trust your eyes, but you can trust your scopes. The scopes are showing us a mimicking of the human visual system in digital imaging and digital signal processing that is really important to how we perceive brightness. So if you have greens in your image, you are going to have to be more careful about where you're placing your contrast than if you've got, say, blues, where only 7% of that brightness is affected by that channel. So this becomes particularly important when we look at creative styles like monochrome style, and how you can actually alter the red, green and blue channels to change directly the amount of illumination that you're getting from those specific channels. So this is actually evidence of that right in front of us, to see that even though we're looking at this test pattern and perceiving three colours that look roughly the same brightness, in fact, the scopes show us that the green is actually dominating in terms of the brightness that's being given, and the blue is way behind at only 7%. So that sampling, 72, 21 and 7, that's very specifically taken from what we know about the way our eyes work. So it's worth knowing when you're working with contrast in colour grading. So I guess the question could be, why do we have this dominance towards green? Where does that come from? Again, it's not particularly relevant to colour grading directly, but I think it's useful to know. Anything that emits light has what's known as a spectral irradiance, and the sun's peak spectral irradiance is just over 500 nanometers, which is basically squarely where green is. So in fact the sun is green. We don't see it as green from Earth, but if you could see the sun with the naked eye outside of our atmosphere, it's actually kicking out predominantly green light. And that's pretty obvious when you think about it, because actually plants are green for a reason. Their whole purpose in life is to convert sunlight to starch for food. If you're going to choose a colour to make chlorophyll so that you can convert as much light energy as possible into food for you, you're obviously going to choose a colour that is where the most amount of energy is coming from. So chlorophyll is green because the sun is kicking out the majority of its spectrum is coming out from that 500, 510, 520, that frequency of the spectrum. So everything to do with, say, memory colours around foliage is fed from the fact that chlorophyll mimics this peak output from the sun. Our colour vision is extrapolating as much brightness information almost as the rods are by looking towards those same frequencies where the sun is kicking out its peak irradiance. And all of that ties together and feeds into how we developed our cameras and our computer monitors and TVs, because as you can see, when we actually analyse the red, green and blue signals as they come into our computer, and we see that actually 72% of that is dominated by the brightness coming from green, then it's red, and then you've got blue quite far behind. So all these things gel together, and it becomes, a useful bit of background knowledge for when you're working through as a colorist and starting to understand how color and brightness and contrast all interplay with each other. One of the most useful things that you can do when you're starting out learning how to color grade is learn how to read scopes. Now, you may already know how to do this through camera operation. Most cameras have histograms, a lot have waveform monitors, and even more third-party monitors that you can mount to your camera have these tools built in. You've even got things on the Red cameras like geoscopes and false color, and there's tons of tools in production, but you might not be used to using them in post. And I'm going to quickly run you through the kind of 4 main scopes that we have available to us in our NLE, or in this case, I'm just going to have a quick look through Resolve. You should find these tools in most software that you choose to use, whether it's your editing package and you're using the color tools in that, or if you're using a dedicated color grading package like I'm using Resolve here. The scopes are going to measure the signal straight from the graphics card from your computer. So it's taking that data straight off the graphics card and it's plotting that on a graph. That's all scopes are, they're just graphs. And it's placing that where we can see it so we can make really informed decisions about how we're pushing and pulling contrast, saturation, hue, and once we know how to read them, we use all of them, and we use them constantly. That's the really key thing about them. In fact, I have a dedicated third monitor here just for my scopes. So I have, at the moment, a 4-way layout, so I can see my Luma waveform, I can see my RGB parade, I can see my vector scope, and I can see my histogram. And we're going to start with the histogram because that's probably the most basic one that we can work with. And in fact, I tend not to use it very much in post. It's one of those things that's on almost all cameras, so I tend to use it if it's the only scope that's built into my camera. Because there are other options in my software package, it normally ends up that I'm using a waveform, but we'll run through them all and you can decide which one is best for each different situation that you find yourself in. So, for example, here with my histogram, I can see that there's kind of like a bunching up along on the left-hand side. It's clearly kind of weighted, if you think of it, that bottom line almost as like a seesaw. You can see that it's kind of weighted towards the left. I've heard people come out with all kinds of crazy things about histograms. The worst offender by far was years and years and years ago. I was actually on I think a Photoshop course, and the guy that was delivering it was saying how you should imagine that that's like a seesaw, that the histogram, and that you should always make sure it's balanced. There should be an equal amount either side, and that's absolute nonsense. If you have an image with a wide dynamic range and there's a real spread of tonality, then yeah, you're going to have a range of tonality across, and it probably will sit quite equally across it. And that's certainly a high dynamic, high contrast image, but that doesn't mean that it's better than something else. The key things you want to look out for, like with most scopes, is are things falling off one end or the other. If it's all bunched right up against the left-hand side, that essentially means that the blacks are crushed, and so that's the exact opposite of clipping. You've got zero data essentially back there. If you're hoping to pull information out of those deep shadow areas, it's almost certainly not there if it's right pushed up against the left-hand side. But it might be that you're pointing at an almost black scene, in which case it stands to reason that you would have all that information bunched up there. If you've also got a candle in the shot, then you're going to see somewhere else much further up along that scope, you're going to see those waveforms for the candle. So bunched up one side isn't necessarily wrong. If you have an average contrast scene or a mid-contrast scene, then, or there's nothing black in your scene, then obviously it's a bit of a telltale sign if everything's bunched up that side that probably you're underexposed. So you have to be careful about things like that. On the other side of things, if you're seeing all of those traces, which is literally the size of the graph that you're seeing there is referred to as a trace. So if you're seeing those traces pushed up right against the other side, then you know that you've got clipped highlights, that you've got a lot of whites right up the end there, and they're kind of starting to bunch up and weight it up the other side. So kind of the opposite of what we've got here. Well, that tells you that you potentially are overexposed, unless of course you're pointing at a very bright scene. You might be filming polar bears in the Arctic, who knows? So it's not necessarily wrong. You need to think about the scene in front of you and then what that scope's telling you. And it's just, and this is the power of them, they don't lie to you. They're reading that video signal and they're just plotting black to white on that graph. So with a histogram, it's looking across the whole scene and it's averaging out that whole scene, and it's literally counting how many pixels there are that are at 0 IRE, and it's plotting them. Okay, so the more you've got of them, the higher that graph is. And that's why if you've got nothing but black, you're going to see just a huge graph up this end and then nothing over here. And so it will start plotting the tonality of your scene from the video signal on that graph, and you get a clear, unbiased, true representation of your signal. And it completely takes out of the equation the inadequacies or the features of the human visual system that kind of sway things all the time for us, that kind of automatic balancing that our brains are doing. If we then move to the waveform monitor, so specifically here I have the Luma waveform, and that's showing me the same information. That's allowing me to see, again, a graph plotting blacks to whites, but it's doing it in a slightly different way and in a way that makes it far more useful and why I use it so much more often than a histogram. So what it's allowing me to see is, instead of plotting all the blacks on the left-hand side and then plotting them across to white on the right-hand side, it's actually turning that upside down. So you end up with your blacks plotted at the bottom and your whites plotted at the top. What's great about that is that then frees up your, if you like, your x-axis to plot them as they appear within your scene. Now this is really crucial because it means that you can actually read the image within the scope. So for example, my head, as it goes left to right, would appear on a waveform monitor to be moving centrally within the frame, because, or probably at the 3/4, wherever I am in the frame right now. So you would be able to clearly see where my head and therefore where my skin tones were reflecting and exposing within that signal. So what's cool about that is you can literally look at your image left to right. So in this example, I have this bright white sofa that's right slap bang in the middle of the image, and I can see it there straddling the middle portion of my waveform monitor, because that's left to right where it appears. So it will look at your image left to right and it will plot essentially in lines. It'll go right from the left-hand edge, then the next row of pixels, and the next row, and it's literally doing it in lines across from the left to the right of your image. And in plotting, is it black? Therefore it goes at the bottom. Is it white? Therefore it goes at the top, or anything in between. So you're effectively killing two birds with one stone, because you're able to not only see how much black or white or grey is in your image, you're able to specifically call out objects as they appear in your scene. So I can clearly see the sofa in this shot appearing along that sort of upper middle. So it's just falling around about sort of 60 IRE. And I can see that clearly on there. As the camera pushes in, you can actually see it changing. So you can see the sofa is now filling more of the screen. And so I go right back to the beginning of this shot where the sofa appears smaller within the frame. I can also see that then shrinking, it's becoming smaller, because that's physically what's happening on the screen as it's getting closer and further away. So it becomes very easy for me to say, look, this is where my sofa falls, this is where the background, the walls are falling, these are the little pings of highlights coming from the bulbs and the cages in the background, this is where the carpet lives. So you're actually really able to start to read those values and then assign in your mind where tonally should those fall. And of course then, once you know that, you can start to think, where do I want them to fall, and you can start to make your corrections based on that.
We spend a lot of time in getting the lighting right on the shoot, and it's interesting. What we do is actually area light over the top of the couch, and then we actually put up a bank of kinos above, and we can actually control them from front to back, left to right. And then the same with the background, we can control the background, but that means that we don't have to do as much in post, because the thing is, in post, I feel that whatever you do, you're always going to see it, or we want to keep a consistency. So this way we've got a consistent feel, and we're actually almost doing the first part. I like to view it of color grading in on the shoot, and then we know where we're going to jump to when we get into post.
Contrast really is something that you should deal with first of all. It should be one of the first things that you do when you're color grading. That allows you to purely focus on color when it comes time to deal with color. You'll be clear to focus on those intensities of hues. Your contrast will be set, and your contrast actually makes a massive difference to the overall aesthetic of the image. So it's a really good place to start before you're doing the more nuanced work with color. So particularly if you're shooting log, obviously you may well be shooting log and then starting with an incredibly flat image. So by opening that up and redistributing that tonality, you're producing an image that's getting closer and closer to something that you're wanting to work with, and starting to kind of develop the color look after that. There's no better way really to begin than making sure that your highlights aren't clipped and your shadows aren't crushed. And this is really where you start to reap the rewards of a good, disciplined production. As I kept sort of emphasizing indirect in color, if you can skip over that stage or get through it incredibly quickly, that means you're very quickly on to getting continuity out of the way and focusing on the look, the stamp that is your visual identity for your film. If you're really battling with clipped highlights or, corrective passes or color tints or things like that, then it just means that you haven't been disciplined enough in camera, or you've, been moving too quickly. You haven't had time to do the things that will kind of set you up for a quick and easy technical grade once you get into post. So I'm going to look at this stuff, and one of the things that I reveal straight away when I look at my scopes is this is an incredibly, let me just disable the grade. So you may kind of think, oh, hang on, did he disable the grade? No, genuinely, that's the grade disabled on this shot. It's almost in the same place, and the reason for that is not because I've just done something throwaway. I took a lot of time to make sure that this was exactly where I thought it should be. The reason it's so close to ideal is because Brett, who shot this commercial, is an incredibly accomplished director, and he works with incredibly accomplished DPs, and they've done their job. They've fed me as a colorist a really good, clean, well-exposed image. So there is almost nothing for me to do in that early technical part of this process. In terms of correcting, there's basically no color casts, and there's a range of contrast which sits really comfortably. There's detail in the shadows. I can see right down at the bottom. If I look in the bottom section of my Luma waveform, I can see there's no flat bottoms. Basically we've got detail in those shadow areas. And because it's a really robust, high quality codec that's coming from, in this case, the C700, I know that even if there is valuable detail in those shadowy areas, I will be able to lift them up cleanly because there's good data there. I've also got highlights. This is a very reflective leather white or light cream sofa, and again, easy to accidentally kind of overexpose or let ride too high, but they've lit it carefully, they've exposed it carefully, and I can see there it is sat comfortably within my highlights. So I've got a fantastic range of contrast there ready to go, and I've actually got everything I need to kind of set that where it should be. So actually, in order to kind of get that correct, and to get that correct, what I've done is I've relied on a chart which they showed. So I've actually got a chart right at the beginning, which is in the same setup that they've used for the whole sequence. And I've got a series of chips along the bottom of the chart that they've used there to help me with my decisions about where the luminance should be. So I've corrected out that image and then applied that to across the rest of them to kind of see where they fall, and actually they're all falling pretty much exactly where they should be very, very quickly. Let me just show you a shot where actually there was a bit of a struggle, and in fact I know that they actually relit this. They changed the way that the talent was walking onto the set in order to counteract what happened in this shot, which was we see her walking through this shaft of light that's been pushed through with an HMI at the back of the set, and it just hits her white dress and it clips, and I can tell it's clipping because I can see right at the top of the waveform monitor that we've got this flat top. It doesn't matter if I pull that down. If I bring that down, it's still flat. There's always going to be no data there because it was clipped in camera, and that could have been fixed by adjusting exposure in camera, but then they would have lost detail in the shadows. So they did exactly what they should have done, is they changed the light and they changed the way that the talent was walking onto the set, and that basically fixed the problem. There is a fair amount of wiggle room if you're shooting with, obviously RAW particularly, even if you're shooting with a compressed format. If it's got a lot of good quality data, so if it's say 10 bits for example, if it's 422 or 444, then there is room for that to potentially come back, but we can't work miracles all the time, and this is just one of those times where that is clipped, and it doesn't matter how good you are as a colorist, I can't recover those highlights. So this is one of those times where I would be kind of thinking about alternatives, looking at alternative takes. Or worst comes to the worst, I'm trying to kind of think of a way of rolling off those clipped areas to make them slightly less obvious. Generally speaking though, if I come to another shot,